So welcome everybody to the Crypto Blockchain Economic Research Forum webinar series. Today's topic is, I would say, particularly practically relevant because it's inspired by a recent change in the world of blockchain. This change occurred on the Ethereum blockchain. Ethereum, of course, is the blockchain on which most of the smart contract activity occurs. In the finance world here, there's been a recent obsession about some of these applications, these decentralized applications in the finance context, in particular, things like Uniswap, which is a decentralized exchange, Compound, Aave, which are lending protocols. All that's happening on Ethereum. The Ethereum blockchain 2 months ago had a very foundational change, which was a change to its transaction fee mechanism. And now, why is that relevant? Well, of course, these very interesting decentralized applications, it turns out that there's more demand for engaging with them than there is supply on these blocks, and so they're competing for space. And it turns out that if you want a lot of activity with interesting things like Uniswap, you need to have not as much activity with things like CryptoKitties, and you need a mechanism, of course, to sort of filter in some sense, and that's what the transaction fee mechanism is ultimately going to be doing. So Ethereum, thought carefully, I guess, about what they had, and they transitioned from what they were using and what's been used in other major blockchains like Bitcoin. And so that's the topic for today. Now, of course, the topic itself is not necessarily easy for everybody because it's on the interface of economics and computer science. So we really wanted to get a speaker who had expertise on that interface, which is actually not a lot of people. So, but I think we did actually succeed in that way. So our speaker today is Tim Roughgarden, who is a professor of computer science at Columbia University. Before that, he was on the computer science faculty at Stanford University for about 15 years. His expertise is broad and deep. His career has been at the interface of economics and computer science. He's for today's talk, I would say two areas in which he's been particularly prominent that are relevant are game theory and mechanism design. Tim, thank you very much for being here and for sharing your work. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thanks for the kind introduction and the context. Thanks to everyone else out there who's sort of tuning in. I know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue out there, so I'm definitely honored any of you would choose to watch Zoom for another hour just to see the seminar. And what I'd like to spend that hour on is telling you about some work I've been doing applying mechanism design techniques to blockchains. As was mentioned, I mean, this is particularly relevant for a major change that happened in the Ethereum blockchain back on August 5th, about 2 months ago. And I should say, there's a Q&A function for those of you that want to ask questions. I will definitely be pausing to sort of clear out a question queue every sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So feel free to just sort of, don't feel like you need to wait till the end. Feel free to ask questions in the middle as well. Okay, so let me tell you maybe just enough about blockchains to kind of explain the mechanism design questions that I'm interested in studying. Right, so fundamentally, what is a blockchain like, say, Bitcoin or Ethereum doing? What is it tasked with? Well, it's maintaining state. And so state could include, for example, the current account balance of all the users of the blockchain, account balance in the native cryptocurrency. And then a blockchain is maintaining an ordered sequence of transactions, basically instructions that get executed that change the current state of the blockchain, right? So for example, someone sends some currency from their account to a different account, both of those account balances change, and that of course changes the overall state. So why is it called a blockchain, right? As opposed to just sort of an ordered sequence of instructions that get executed? Well, transactions are sort of decided upon in batches. Okay, and these batches are called blocks, and then they're sort of chained together, hence the blockchain. And for our purposes, all that's really relevant about this process, with blocks being added to the blockchain one at a time, is that first of all, blocks can only be so big. And second of all, blocks can only be produced every so often, okay? And so, the details depend on the blockchain. Bitcoin, the block size, at least for a long time, they had a block size of 1 megabyte, and they produced blocks, once every 10 minutes. Ethereum measures transaction cost, not just in sort of raw size, but rather in a metric known as gas, just meant as a proxy for the computational and storage requirements of the transaction. And Ethereum produces blocks more frequently, more like once every 13 seconds. Each one has a cap of 15 million units of gas, which you should think of as like ballpark, maybe a few hundred transactions, maybe 500 transactions in a block. In any case, with blocks only every so often and only so big, we have on our hands a scarce resource. Okay, there's only so many transactions per second one of these blockchains can process. And for really successful blockchains, including Bitcoin and Ethereum, demand is far, far larger than supply. Okay, so if getting your sort of transaction executed was free, you'd have way more people that would want to submit transactions than you have room for on the blockchain. So boom, you've got a sort of resource allocation problem, a mechanism design problem. Generally a scarce resource you'd like to allocate in the most economically efficient way. You would like to sort of you would like to grant the privileged access to that resource to those for whom it's the most valuable. So of all these transactions that random people are submitting to one of these blockchains, we would like a mechanism that screens out the most valuable ones to get the best use of this scarce resource. So that's why transaction fees just sort of immediately come up when you're thinking about the design of blockchains that are heavily used. So maybe I shouldn't call this state of the art anymore. Maybe I should call this, like the old status quo would be more accurate. So let me tell you how the transaction fee mechanism has worked, in particular in Bitcoin since inception, since early 2009 when it launched, and also in Ethereum until 2 months ago. Okay, so it's a pay-as-bid mechanism. In this sort of area, people usually call them first price auctions. And so as a user, if you want to transfer funds from one account to another, you submit that transaction to the blockchain, but you are also responsible for attaching a bid along with that transaction. So an offer in the native currency about how much you'd be willing to pay for your transaction to actually be executed, to actually be included in the blockchain. And so if your transaction is included, then in fact, you will pay this. It's a pay as bid mechanism. Now, to whom does that get paid? Okay. So perhaps you've heard in proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin and like Ethereum is, at least up to this point, entities called miners compete for the privilege of sort of authorizing that next batch of transactions and adding the next block to the blockchain. There's this thing called the proof of work lottery. They're basically trying to sort of invert some kind of cryptographic hash function. The details here will not be important for us at all. Okay. One thing that is just worthy of noting is that we have no idea who these miners are, right? Literally anybody can sort of download software and start trying to mine blocks and add them to Bitcoin or Ethereum. In that sense, they're open or permissionless blockchains. And what is going to be really important for us is that if a miner actually, is elected, if it actually kind of solves one of these crypto puzzles, at that point, it has dictatorial control over the contents of the block that it's going to be adding to the blockchain. Okay. Now, what do we sort of expect miners to probably be doing? And what and they do often do this is to maximize their own revenue. So they'll include the transactions with the highest bids, and they'll pack the block as full as possible with the highest bidding transactions. And so then once that miner adds the block to the blockchain, then all of these bids are transferred to that miner. Okay. So users submit transactions. Bids are attached to them. Upon inclusion in the blockchain, upon inclusion in some block, that bid is transferred in full to the miner of that block, the block that includes their transactions. Okay, so that's a pay-as-bid. That's the pay-as-bid mechanism. Now, this audience. So this is natural enough, right? It's Bitcoin and Ethereum worked pretty well for sort of many years. On the other hand, with this audience, if we wanted to throw tomatoes, right, at first price auctions, like we all know how to do it, right? In particular, we know that the bidding tends to be tricky in first price auctions. There's a lot of cognitive burden to sort of reason about what your competitors' valuations are likely to be, reason about how much your competitors are shading their bids, how much should you shade your bid. And in any case, in first price auctions, you tend to have ex post regret, right? Either you lost and someone else won at a price you would have been willing to pay, or you won, but you overpaid and you could have actually, in hindsight, made a much smaller bid and gotten it more cheaply. And so just to sort of make this point a little bit more concrete, like this difficulty of bidding in first price auctions, so this is for Ethereum's old transaction mechanism. This is a screenshot of a wallet. Okay, so if you're a user of one of these blockchains, you're usually not actually attaching the bid to, often you use what's known as a wallet, which is a piece of software which sort of mediates between, you, the end user, and the blockchain itself. So generally, you would be using the software, and then it would attach the bid, and then it would submit it to the network. And so this is Metamask, which is the most popular Ethereum wallet. And as you can see, when you submit a transaction, it actually offers you a menu. And so it says, if you want to get your transaction included really quickly, like say in 30 seconds, then you should pay sort of a relatively high price. If you're happy to wait for 30 minutes or whatever, you can probably go away with a lower bid. Okay. And smart people work in MetaMask, right? So they have, they try to come up with clever algorithms to sort of estimate, what these fees should be when they make recommendations to you, based on recent past data and so on. But any regular user of Ethereum will have had the experience where they basically got bad advice from their wallet, right? So for example, maybe the wallet recommended $22, but actually, that's not high enough. It's out of date, and the competition's gotten much tougher since then. And so you have the experience of for example, choosing the high fee here, and yet still having your transaction sort of, pending for 30 minutes, just because it turns out the demand kind of shot up right around the time that you submitted your transaction. So, first price auctions, they've always known to be kind of tricky and all kinds of experiments, but it's really borne out in, in the actual way that these blockchains are used. So let me see, are there any questions?
There aren't any questions in the Q&A right now.
Okay, great. So we need transaction fee mechanisms. Probably the first thing you might think of is pay as bid. That was used for a long time. If we wanted to criticize them, we'd say, oh, well, it's sort of hard to figure out how to bid in them. And that's not just, kind of an experiment, that's really in the field as well. And given that drawback, the difficulty of figuring out what fee you should be paying, as a mechanism designer, it's natural to then ask, could we in some sense do better? And better could mean many things, but for example, stronger incentive compatibility properties, right? And maybe the holy grail there would be, like a dominant strategy incentive compatible mechanism, like a second price auction or a VCG mechanism, right? So it's natural to ask, could we replace this first price auction with something where it's much easier, ideally a dominant strategy to figure out how to bid? And as was mentioned, I hope this problem seems reasonably natural and sort of fundamental to you, like it's worthy of study in its own right. But specifically for Ethereum, this wound up being a very timely study because of a major change they made to their transaction fee mechanism known as EIP-1559. So that launched, it was either August 4th or August 5th. I don't quite remember, but about 2 months ago. At the time I did this work, which was in sort of fall 2020, it was not at all a foregone conclusion that this new transaction mechanism would be adopted. And so this is a Google search from roughly a year ago, even a year ago, for the seemingly obscure sort of phrase. You already had 500,000 hits, and the headlines reference that it's polarizing in some way. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it, and because of this, so the advocates for switching the transaction fee mechanism, and again, they were motivated by just wanting something that was easier to use, right? That just sort of had, that was much more trivial to figure out how to bid in. So the advocates sort of sensed the community, discontent, and were proactive about it. So Tim Byko, who's sort of a major figure in the Ethereum community, this was actually exactly a year ago, I now notice. So he did a sort of community outreach survey. So he talked to a bunch of people. He talked to, for example, miners. He talked to people who sort of write these software wallets. He talked to people who run exchanges, and he asked them all, like, what do you think about this EIP-1559 proposal, this new transaction fee mechanism, which I will tell you about. But so it was, so he asked people what they thought, thumbs up, thumbs down. And if you're not comfortable with possibly making this major change to the transaction fee mechanism, what would make you more comfortable with that change? And various things were mentioned, right? But what I want to highlight here, what's underlined is, quote, the lack of a formal specification or proof for the mechanism that people can independently evaluate and critique, unquote. And I want to emphasize, like, the respondents to this survey, these are not kind of, researchers writing papers, et cetera. These are people really in the trenches building, right? And from that group, there was really kind of a visceral hunger for a formal, rigorous analysis about, what properties this new transaction fee mechanism might or might not have. And that was definitely one of one of the main motivations of the work I'm going to describe. Okay, so here's the way I'm going to sort of set this up, sort of frame the mechanism design problem. I want to spend this slide outlining a sequence of challenges, sort of idiosyncratic sort of aspects of doing mechanism design on the blockchain. Okay, so there's going to be challenges sort of 1 through 4, okay, all of which are unfamiliar to traditional mechanism design applications. This first one I've labeled challenge 0 because it's very familiar in mechanism design applications, which is that obviously users can be strategic, right? They have private information, you can ask them for it, but they might tell you anything, right? They might bid less than the valuation, they might bid more, who knows, okay? We also know the language for saying we want a mechanism robust to strategic behavior by the participants, namely we might want a truthful or dominant strategy incentive compatible mechanism. Okay, so again, that's going to be our holy grail on the side of incentive compatibility on the user's side of the market. So let's get to the more blockchain specific idiosyncrasies. So first, as I mentioned, right, these miners who are competing for the privilege of adding blocks to the blockchain, when you earn that privilege, okay, when you sort of solve one of these proof of work crypto puzzles, you have total control over what the block contains, okay? And this has implications for the transaction fee mechanism design. Because if you may design a mechanism and you may have in mind some allocation rule, right, that you want to be carried out, but the miner is under no contractual obligation to carry out the allocation rule that you had in mind. Again, it can fill this block however it wants, all right? So we're going to want another incentive compatibility constraint, basically stating that miners should be properly motivated to carry out the intended allocation rule. So carrying out the intended allocation should actually be profit maximizing for miners. Okay, so that'll be encoded in what I'm going to call the MMIC condition, which I'll show you on the next slide. Another kind of weird quirk of the blockchain setting is that payments should be independent of the losing bids, okay, which obviously is different than something like second price auction. And the reason for this is that blockchains are basically hermetically sealed environments. Okay, so they don't reference anything from the external world outside the blockchain itself. And only the winning transactions are recorded on chain. Okay, they're the ones that get executed, they're the ones that get included in a block, and you really have no idea how many other transactions wanted to get into that block, and you have no idea what they're willing to pay. Okay, or at least much later on, you have no idea what it was. Okay, it's not recorded for posterity. So we're going to be looking at sort of payment rules that are functions only of winning bids, independent of losing bids. Challenge 3 is kind of an extension of challenge 1, right? So a miner has total control over the contents of a block that it mines, and moreover, it's basically costless to sort of create your own transactions. So if it's in a miner's interest, they are free to sort of pack their block with in effect shill bids. Okay, fake transactions that are just going to wind up being payments back to themselves. And if you want to know why people you rarely hear about second price auctions or sort of the VCG mechanism in the context of blockchains, at least at the consensus level, this is the #1 reason. This is the real stake in the heart of VCG type mechanisms. Those mechanisms are quite easy to manipulate through the injection of fake bids. So this will also be wrapped up in our MMIC definition on the next slide. Finally, so in addition to users perhaps deviating, misreporting, in addition to miners perhaps deviating, okay, to maximize their profits, we also want to worry about miners and users colluding. Okay, and in fact, this is the kind of thing you often don't necessarily think that much about in traditional mechanism design applications. But especially in sort of a smart contract platform like Ethereum, it is really not hard at all to set up side channels to organize basically guaranteed payments amongst a coalition, possibly a coalition of a miner with some of the users who submitted transactions for that block. And so we'll talk about this more concretely when I give you this definition of OCA proofness. But this is going to be another incentive guarantee that we really want, and it's really going to drive a lot of the details of how the new transaction fee mechanism works. All right, so I think I saw, okay. Okay, good. So thanks Fahad for answering the questions. That's great.
Sure.
Okay, so challenges 1 through 4 is what makes this, so we'd like to stand on the shoulders of all of the giants that have developed the amazingly beautiful and also practically useful field of mechanism design, but there are quirks of this application which require us to rethink things a little bit. Okay, and so that's what I want to talk you through. All right, so this first definition is going to handle challenges 1 and 3. Okay, so let's see, why would a miner? Okay, so Alexei asks, why would a miner include fake transactions in the block? It's the same reason why on eBay you might want to submit a bid on your own behalf, just basically to push somebody else's winning bid up higher. So if you think about how second price auctions work, where the price is set by the second highest bid, if the real second highest bid is lower than you'd like, you're tempted to submit your own bid that can then act as the second highest bid and boost your revenue for you. So there might be other reasons as well, but for this audience, the immediate sort of issue is if you tried to implement a second price auction, you would definitely expect miners to do this. There's literally no reason why they couldn't or wouldn't do this. And then of course it devolves back to a first price auction once you have kind of the auctioneer submitting sort of shill bids. Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay. So we've got these 4 challenges. So we've got this challenge 0 that's handled by the usual DSIC constraint. Now for the other challenges, we want a couple new incentive compatibility constraints. So this is for challenges 1 and 3 that miners have dictatorial control over the contents of a block, and moreover can even fabricate transactions to include in it if it sort of boosts their profit from the transaction fee mechanism. Okay, and so the definition here is really just what you'd think, right? So we think about as usual, a mechanism is the combination of an allocation rule and a payment rule, and we call it MMIC. That's incentive compatible for myopic miners. Myopic meaning it's a miner thinking only about sort of its rewards from the current block that it's just now mining. So as MMIC, if following the intended allocation rule X is guaranteed to maximize the overall rewards to that miner. Okay, so the sum of the money that they make from all of the transactions that they include. Now, some of you may know that actually miners derive revenue from 2 sources. There's a block reward in addition to transaction fees. The block reward is just fixed, right? So in Ethereum, it's 2 ETH per block, which is roughly $7,000 last time I looked. And that's independent of what the miner does. So we can just ignore that for the purposes of understanding miners' best responses. So they're really aiming to maximize the sum of the transaction fees. And we call it MMIC if following the allocation rule, in fact, it does that. As discussed, the VCG mechanism badly fails this condition because fake transactions can boost the miner revenue. On the other hand, something like a first price auction is kind of definitely MMIC, right? In a first price auction, the pay as bid mechanism, what you're expecting miners to do is to pack their block as full as possible with the transactions with the highest bids. That's like literally what you want to see happen if you roll out a pay as bid mechanism. And meanwhile, the miners are like, sounds good to me. That's exactly how I maximize my profit. So sort of right out of the box, first price auctions obviously satisfy this. Second price type auctions actually do not. Okay. Oh, and I should say, right, so they maximize their profit not merely by following the allocation rule, but also, without injecting any fake transactions. So they're just motivated to run the allocation rule on the set of real transactions and just actually include exactly the transactions suggested by the allocation rule. Okay. So let me get now to the final constraint, and this is where we worry about collusion between the miner of a block and users that are submitting transactions. And again, such collusion really is, it really happens today in many different ways already. Okay, you really have on-chain smart contracts. You can also have kind of off-chain side payments like you can in real life, but you can even keep the side payments purely on-chain, mediated by smart contracts. So this really is a real threat. This is not hypothetical. And so it's going to be OCA proofness. So OCA here stands for an off-chain agreement, again, possibly enforced by an on-chain contract. And we call it transaction fee mechanism OCA proof if it's impossible for miners and users to collude to strictly improve their joint utility compared to what they would achieve just by behaving normally on-chain. So I want to make this definition as hard to satisfy as possible. So I'm going to allow relatively powerful coalitions. In particular, it's a transferable utility model. So arbitrary side payments are allowed between the miner and the creators of transactions in the block. Okay. So to understand this definition, right, so we can go back to a first price auction, the pay as bid auction, and it's easy to convince yourself that that's OCA proof. You're really not worried about collusion because whatever side payments the miner and users wanted to do sort of outside the mechanism, they can do perfectly well in the mechanism, okay, just by having the users bid whatever it is they would have been paying the miner in the side payment. So there's really no point in going off chain if it's a first price auction. Maybe more helpful is to look at an example where you don't satisfy this. So imagine you wanted to supplement the transaction fee mechanism with a reserve price. And a reserve price implemented in the most straightforward way, meaning, first of all, transactions that bid below it are ineligible for inclusion, but otherwise everything is the same. And so in particular, all the revenue from the reserve price is passed on to the miner of that block. Okay, that would be the most straightforward way of trying to add a reserve price. And a non-zero reserve price can be completely defeated through an off-chain agreement. Okay, so really what I just said doesn't work at all. Okay, it's equivalent to having a reserve price of 0. The reason is that there could be sort of a side agreement. The miner basically just says, look, everyone, go ahead and submit a bid. So suppose the reserve is, like 10. And a lot of people are willing to pay 7, but are not willing to pay 10, say. So the miner will basically just advertise, look, everybody, just bid 10 in the mechanism so that at least you're eligible for inclusion. And then if I include you, I promise you I will refund the difference. So if you sort of bid to me 7 off-chain, bid 10 on-chain, I'll include you and then refund you the remaining 3. Okay? So you can really just sort of re-implement a pay-as-bid auction with 0 reserve by completely circumventing the reserve price. So that's an example of how an off-chain agreement can really, it's an example of a mechanism which the reason it's unsuitable for this environment is exactly because of these off-chain agreements. Okay. All right, so what I focused on so far is the challenges of the blockchain setting and why we can't just look up and deploy something on page 7 of some mechanism design textbook. But let's also sort of look at the bright side. Let's ask ourselves, are there any sort of idiosyncratic advantages we have going for us, given that, we're implementing this in a blockchain setting? And there is, okay? So number one, when the mechanism is run, it's not operating in a vacuum, right? This is not like some, crazy Spectrum auction that's going to be, run once and then never again. Okay, in Ethereum, whatever transaction fee mechanism you deploy, it's going to be run every 13 seconds on average, every block, over and over and over again. So one thing that means is you are free to use the outcomes of past blocks, so past performance of the mechanism, to inform what you do in the current block. And again, remember, everything here is public, or the winning transactions, the included transactions, and their bids of all previous blocks. Those are all public. And you are free to use them programmatically in whatever mechanism you sort of want to use in the current block. Okay. For example, to be concrete, you could imagine implementing a reserve price. I know I just said reserve prices don't work. We'll get back to that. But you could imagine using the outcome of past auctions and the bids of the winners to set a reserve price for the current block. Okay. That's what I mean by using the history to inform how you run the mechanism now. All right. Benefit number 2 is that while the bad news is that the miner has dictatorial control over the contents of the block, like on which transactions get included in the block, the protocol has total control over the flow of money for the transactions that wind up getting included. Okay? So for example, in a first price auction, the way it used to work, it was sort of hard coded in the protocol that, as a miner, if you put a transaction with some bid in your block, automatically that bid will be transferred to you. Okay? And that's just how it worked, and no one could do anything about it. That is not the only way you could direct the money, right? So if you wanted, you could hard code in the protocol that the bid attached to a transaction, for example, gets burned. It just gets taken out of circulation, or gets sent to people other than the current miner. right? Maybe it's a foundation, maybe it's miners of other blocks, who knows? Okay? But so the point is, because the miner can't affect the code of the protocol, it can only affect the payments to it through its choices about the allocation. So miners control the allocation, protocol controls the flow of the payments. Okay, so that's also very nice. There's a lot of flexibility in what to do with the payments paid by the creators of transactions that get included in a block. Okay? And the new Ethereum transaction fee mechanism will make crucial use of both of these opportunities. Okay? So, I said a mechanism is an allocation rule and a payment rule. Now it's sort of helpful to think about it as sort of split the payment rule into two parts. The payment rule P, that's going to be the part of the user's payment that goes to the miner of the block. So this used to be everything, but now we're going to allow some of what's paid by the users to go elsewhere, okay, to be burned, to go to other miners, whatever, okay? And this is all of the setup, right? So this is what I mean by a transaction fee mechanism, a choice of an allocation, payment, and burning rule. I've told you the 3 incentive compatibility guarantees that I really want. Okay, the usual DSIC constraint that handles the users, the MMIC constraint that says miners are motivated to do like we'd like them to do, and then also coalitions of users and miners. That's the OCA proofness condition. And so now I hope it's clear, what the scientific question is, which is, to what extent can a transaction fee mechanism achieve these 3 properties simultaneously? Okay, can you get them all? If you can't get them all, how close can you get? And that's what this research is about. Okay, that's now the mechanism design question that I want to really probe. All right. It's a good time to pause for questions. Let's see. So
there is one.
Jerry says, one thing that often is mentioned for Ethereum miners is a potential third source of revenue, miner extractable value, which may influence how they order transactions and or decide which ones to include. Any thoughts on the importance, relevance of this third revenue channel? That's an excellent question. I think that's a really excellent question to take sort of at the end of the talk. I'd say they interact a little bit, but not a lot. I think this will be easy. So this is a great question. Let's take this up again at the end. So please remind me if I forget at the end. That's, I think, the optimal time to talk about this. Someone had their hand up, I feel like I saw. So maybe it's good.
Should I bring that person into the discussion? Should I unmute them? Or do you want to do
Q&A is probably better if that's possible. So I see a Dr. Vani Kamath. So if it's possible to use the Q&A functionality, that would be ideal, I think.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So hopefully we understand the design space now, right? Allocation, payment, burning rule, triples. 3 notions of incentive compatibility. We want to satisfy as many of them as we can. Okay, 1 for the users, 1 for the miners, and 1 for coalitions of users and miners. Okay, so, and so just to review, right? We've sort of talked about we've talked about a few transaction fee mechanisms. So the status quo, or the old status quo, first price auctions. Obviously, they're not DSIC at all, right? You definitely don't have a dominant strategy. You want to shade your bid. How much you shade your bid depends on what other players are doing. We argue that it is kind of obviously MMIC, and it is sort of obviously OCA proof. So we get 2 out of the 3 with the first price auction. So better, presumably means retaining those second 2 properties and achieving, or at least doing better on the first of them. We also talked about a transaction fee mechanism that fails the MMIC constraint, right? So the VCG mechanism, or even a second price auction, fails MMIC because of the manipulability by shill bids. And we talked about how reserve price-based options, at least naively implemented, fail OCA proof. Okay, so we've talked about 3 different mechanisms. Each of them fails one of these 3 things quite badly. Okay, so if there's going to be something that gets the best of all worlds, it's going to have to look a little different. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about next, something known as EIP-1559. This is the transaction fee mechanism that Ethereum switched to 2 months ago. Okay, so I want to first just tell you kind of how it works. Okay, what are the main ideas in this design? And then I want to talk about the properties, the extent to which it satisfies the 3 different incentive compatibility constraints that I outlined. Okay, let me say at the outset, this design was proposed by Vitalik Buterin, who is also the founder of Ethereum. The ideas were sort of floating around for a while, for several years. And I think the spec was formally written probably in 2018, and then sort of through 2019 and 2020, there was sort of increasing interest in getting this deployed. Okay. All right, so three main ideas in EIP-1559. Idea number one is going to be a reserve price. So in this context, it's going to be called a base fee. And as promised, it will indeed be informed by what's happened in the previous blocks, okay, by the outcomes of previous invocations of the mechanism. Now, wait a minute, you say. Didn't I argue that reserve prices don't work at all, right? You sort of have this violation of OCA proofness, and they have a side channel, and it's just like the reserve price is zero. Yes, all that's true. All that's true for the most naive way of implementing the reserve price, meaning you can continue to pass all revenue onto the miner of that block. But remember, we don't have to do that, right? So the protocol has tremendous flexibility over what happens to that revenue. And in fact, in the new transaction fee mechanism, all of the revenues generated from the reserve price, from the base fee, are burned, okay, are taken out of circulation. So EIP-1559, I mean, sometimes you hear people say it makes Ethereum deflationary, which is not quite right. It makes it less inflationary than it was before. Inflation naturally arises in blockchains like Ethereum because there's a block reward that's newly printed money that goes along with each block. And because of the burning that's been happening over the last couple of months, the inflation rate in Ethereum has been cut in half, okay? So I should say, like, the original motivation, as I understand it, this new transaction fee mechanism was what I said, to make it easier for people to figure out what to bid. But it also, as a side effect, has a macroeconomic effect on sort of Ethereum, right, on its monetary policy, which a number of people are actually quite excited about that aspect as well, okay? So, but here, it's really the game theory that's driving it, right? We're not trying to sort of change the monetary policy. We really just sort of want a reserve price that actually is enforceable, that actually has bites. And what we'll see is that actually you can actually achieve OCA proofness as long as you don't pass this reserve price revenue onto the miner, as long as you do something else with it. The game theory is going to be the same no matter what else you do with it. In EIP-1559, it is burned. Okay, so that is how the current deployment works. Okay. All right, so good. So this is going to be this reserve price. We're going to burn the revenues. What is that reserve price going to be set to? I mean, I said it's going to be informed by what happened in the past, but how exactly? Well, in a perfect world, right, you would love a market clearing price such that exactly, so remember the block size in Ethereum is 15 million gas. Okay, gas is a measure of the sort of computational and storage cost of a transaction, and there's a budget of 15 million gas per block. So the ideal reserve price would be a market clearing price, where exactly 15 million worth of gas of transactions is willing to pay it, nothing more, nothing less. Because then your scarce resource would be fully allocated and allocated to the most valuable transactions, exactly the transactions that were willing to pay your reserve price. Okay. Now, you know, demand, both on a short time scale and a long time scale, is pretty volatile for a blockchain like Ethereum. So the market clearing price is changing. It's just, so, you know, it actually can change by a pretty large factor. Okay, sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. So to, you know, if we're aspiring toward, you know, being close to this market clearing price, we're going to need to have an adjustment process. Okay, we're going to need to have a way for the base fee to rise in times of increasing demand, and conversely to fall in times of decreasing demand. And a natural idea is to use some kind of tâtonnement process. Okay, so to sort of observe excess demand. If excess demand is positive, raise the reserve price. Otherwise, you know, if the demand actually is less, the demand at the current price is less than supply, then you want to decrease the reserve price. But now, again, there's sort of there's actually an interesting issue that comes up thinking about how we would implement this in Ethereum, which is, remember that only the winning transactions are recorded for posterity on chain. Okay, the losing transactions are not recorded. So if you're looking back at the most recent blocks, you know, and you see you've had a bunch of sort of full blocks in a row, 15 million gas, how can you differentiate between scenario one, where your base fee is exactly right, it's exactly the one you want, and exactly 15 million gather transactions are willing to pay it, versus your base fee being way too low? So you're seeing the lucky 15 million gas that got into the block, But what you don't see is that there might be 20 million more units of gas that did not get into the block. Okay? And if that were the case, you would want to be increasing your reserve price. So that brings us to key idea number 2, which is going to provide us with an on-chain signal about excess demand. All right? So this is another really actually quite significant modification to how Ethereum works, which is that it's now post EIP-1559 more flexible about block sizes. So in the old world, there was a hard cap. Every single block had to have size at most 15 million gas, and no exceptions. Now we're going to say, you know what? Really, what matters is that we have amortized block size at most 15 million gas. So on average, over a decently long time window, we want to make sure that the average block size is at most 15 million. We don't necessarily care if the occasional block is more. The occasional block shouldn't be infinitely big, so we're going to still, it still keeps a maximum block size, which is double the target. So the target block size is going to be 15 million. It's not a hard cap. The hard cap is going to be 30. Okay. And so the point here is to really allow, to give the blockchain more flexibility, basically borrowing against its future capacity today, okay, if it's necessary or if it's worthwhile to meet a sudden demand spike. Okay. And now what I want you to notice is, with this change, we actually can now have a reliable on-chain signal of whether the reserve price, whether the base fee is too high or too low. If the last block was bigger than the target, okay, so bigger than 15 million, could have been as big as 30, but if it was bigger than 15 million, that's more than we want. So I guess we better increase the reserve price to reduce demand at that price. Alternatively, if the last block is if the last block is too small, that means our reserve price appears to be too high. So we should decrease it. Okay, and so that's how the top-to-bottom process is going to work. Okay, it's really going to just look. So it's actually not going to look at the bids in the previous blocks at all. It's just going to look at how big the blocks were. Big blocks, price goes up. Small blocks, price goes down. Okay. There is a specific formula. For those of you that are curious, I put the specific formula here on the slide. This is not important, actually, for the economic guarantees I want to talk about today. But just for completeness, basically, if you ever see a double full block, for the next block, the base fee rises by 12.5%. If you ever see an empty block, the next base fee drops by 12.5%. And then you just linearly interpolate between those two extremes. And so that's what the update rule looks like right now. All right, so let me see a couple questions have come in. Got that one. Total payments. Good. So CMAC, first of all, thanks for coming. Second of all, that's again, I think, a good one for the end of the talk. I think it's a great question, very much off of sort of the shortest path through the talk. So I will get back to that as well. Thank you for the question. Okay, so key idea number 2, variable size blocks. Big blocks increase the price, small blocks decrease the price. We still need a third key idea though. And there's 2 reasons we need a third key idea, why we're not done. There's 2 things that should be bothering you. So first of all, if we're burning all the revenue, why should any miner bother to do anything? Why should they bother to solve these kinds of proof of work crypto puzzles? Well, okay, there's the block reward. Okay, so they're still going to get sort of no matter what, the block reward will be newly printed money. It'll still be given to the miner. So that's like $7,000 a block. So that's some motivation for bothering to solve these crypto puzzles. But on the other hand, like the block reward is independent of the contents of the block. So you could mine empty blocks, include no transactions at all, and collect the block reward. So why wouldn't miners just do that? What's their incentive to include any transactions at all? Question number 2 that you might be wondering about is like, what happens exactly if, the current reserve price is sufficiently low that the demand at that price is actually more than our hard cap of 30 million. So that's a really bad, that's the reserve price that's way off of the market clearing price, right? Market clearing would get us 15. We're saying not only are we sort of too low, we're so far too low that the demand is more than double our target. But that might happen, and what do we do, right? So now there's more transactions that want to get included at that price than we have room for. How do we pick among them? So we're going to answer both of those two questions with the same, third key idea, which is, in this new transaction fee mechanism, there's basically a first price auction kind of sprinkled on top. Really just sort of meant for emergencies. You sort of revert to the first price auction if you really need it. The terminology they use is tips. So the way it's going to work, if you submit a transaction now to Ethereum, it's actually a little bit more complicated. You now have to specify 2 bidding parameters. Previously, all you specified was 1. Just how much you're willing to pay. The way it works now is you submit 1 parameter, which is just the maximum you're willing to pay, right? That's what we're hoping is going to be like a private valuation. And then furthermore, so that's maximum willingness to pay to everybody, because this is just the user is not willing to pay in sum more than this. And the user also specifies a tip, which is then transferred to the miner of that block, okay, like transaction fees were in the old days, okay? So in effect, for a given base fee, right, a user is bidding either like the base fee plus the extra tip it's willing to pay the miner, or its fee cap, whichever is smaller. Okay, so that's the bid induced by the choice of the fee cap and the tip with respect to a given base fee. Okay, and then as always, the revenue from the base fee, so the R, that gets burned. Whatever's left over, either the tip or the residue, is going to be directed to the miner. Okay, and again, I encourage you to think of this as just kind of like a little mini first price auction layered on top of the base fee. And often when I get to this part of the design, I mean, I sense a feeling of disappointment from the people I'm talking to, because I started the story by saying like we don't really like first price auctions. So it's sort of hard to figure out how to bid, and we'd like to do something better. And I get to this part of the design, and a natural reaction is like, but wait a minute, now we just have a first price auction all over again. But so here's the way to think about it. Okay, so this first price auction is only relevant when you have sort of an unexpected increase in demand. When things are operating normally and the reserve price somewhere resembles the market clearing price, maybe it's a little too low, so maybe you have not 15 million demand at that, but you have 18 million, whatever. You can pack the blocks up to 30 million. So as long as the base fee isn't way too low, you have adequate room in a 30 million gas block for everybody interested, everybody eligible at that particular base fee. Right, and so at that point, you're actually in an uncongested setting, right? The eligible transactions are not competing with each other, so they can just bid something very small. Okay, they can bid, so something like sort of 2 gwei. Gwei is sort of a unit of ether, and that's a small number. That would be a canonical thing you would bid. Now, once in a while, the reserve price might be sort of so low that you do wind up having to compete with people to get into the 30 million gas block. But then in that hopefully rare case, you're still no worse than the previous design. So the hope would be, 90% of the time, you don't have to reason about the tip at all. You just put some nominal tip. And then, the other 10% of the time, if you want to guarantee yourself immediate inclusion, well, yeah, then actually you do have to think like in a first price auction. But for the casual user, most of the time, the idea is, delta should just be nominal. Delta should be, a very small amount. And all you have to do is sort of think about your fee cap, okay, which is just like reporting your valuation. Okay, so that is EIP-1559. All right, so big ideas, base fee gets burned, variable size blocks allow you to implement a tâtonnement process to try to approximate the market clearing price, and then the tip mechanism, kind of to rescue you when you have a sudden demand shock. Okay, when the reserve price is low, but then the demand goes way up, and you're waiting for the base fee to catch up, you have this first price auction you can resort to in the transitory period in between. So let me just kind of give away the punchlines before I tell you any more sort of technical details. Let me just tell you how the old transaction fee mechanism and the new one do with respect to my incentive compatibility criteria. First price auction we mentioned, definitely MMIC, definitely OCA proof, not how to prove either of those, definitely not DSIC. And then another thing which is kind of frustrating about the first price auction is it's not exploiting at all the unique advantages available in the blockchain setting. Okay, it's not exploiting the repeated nature of the mechanism, right? Every block is exactly the same as if it was the first block that ever happened. And it's also not doing anything interesting with the direction of payments. Okay, it's just transferring it on to the miner. So EIP-1559, as we discussed, really does take advantage of both of those benefits. Okay, and so it uses the blockchain history to figure out what the reserve price should be. And then for the game theory, it's really crucial that it does not pass base fee revenue onto the miner, that it sends it elsewhere, for example, burning it. And so with respect to the three criteria I mentioned, so the good news is it's both MMIC and OCA proof. It is not, these are not hard proofs to prove that, but it's not as obvious as for first price auctions. And in particular, it's really important that the base fee is a function purely of the past history. It's independent of anything that happens in the current block. That's crucial for MMIC. It's crucial that the base fee revenues are burned. That's crucial for OCA proofness. So it does use, the proofs of those two properties do rely on details of the design. Okay? That said, the proofs are not long, but I mean, they're sensitive. And so the details of the mechanism are meant so that those guarantees do indeed hold. Okay, so what about DSIC, right? That was the thing we were trying to fix. Well, obviously, if for some reason your current base fee is like basically zero, right? Because like suppose the blockchain was empty for the past week, and then all of a sudden all these people show up, right? That's just like a first price auction, right? Your reserve price is basically zero. You don't have room for everybody, so like people have to compete, through their tips, like they would in the first price auction. So obviously, there's a special scenario in which we're not DSIC. Okay, that being when our base fee is way too low given the current demand, presumably because we just had a demand shock coming out of a stable period of low demand. Okay? So what I want to argue is that that's in some sense, that's almost the only obstruction to having dominant strategy incentive compatibility, right? So as long as your base fee isn't excessively low, way off because of a recent demand shock, then actually there's an obvious optimal bid for the participants. So let me just say that guarantee in a little bit more detail, and then I'll sort of go on to kind of some open questions and concluding comments. So this theorem is going to lay out two conditions under which it's sort of a basically dominant strategy for a user to just set the tip to something nominal and to set their fee cap to the valuation. So as I said, I mean, the one thing that can go wrong is if the base fee is way too low because of a recent demand shock. So we're going to assume that's not true. So we're going to assume the base fee is at least high enough that the demand at that price is at most 30 million gas. Okay, so that everybody willing to pay the base fee would fit inside a double full block. All right. So it could still be way too low relative to the market clearing price, but it has to at least be close enough that you have at most double the demand that you'd like to see. You might think that would be the only thing that can go wrong. The other annoying thing that can go wrong is if users overbid for whatever reason. It would be a dominated strategy to do this, but in principle, users could set fee caps that are strictly higher than their valuations. And then in effect, even if your base fee is sort of appropriate for the underlying demand curve, it acts as if it's too low with respect to the reported bids that are on chain. Right? So basically you were for some reason given this fake demand curve that's much bigger than the real one. So your very reasonable base fee artificially looks excessively low with respect to the sort of kind of fictitious shifted up demand curve. Okay. So yeah, I don't think it's that big a restriction, but technically for the theorem to be true, I do need to assume that users do not overbid. And again, it would be a dominated strategy to overbid. Now, as long as these two things are true, then in fact, truthful bidding is guaranteed to be utility maximizing for every user, no matter what their valuation, no matter what the valuations of the other bidders as well. Okay, so in that sense, it's a dominant strategy to bid truthfully. Basically, it's in this regime when there's no competition for the 30 million units of gas, the mechanism is really just acting as a posted price mechanism, where that posted price is equal to the base fee, or maybe the base fee plus some nominal amount to give minimal incentives to the miner. Okay, so because under these conditions you don't have competition, the incentives all work out just fine. Okay, and I should say, like, one thing that's nice about the fact that it's posted price in this sense, it even gives you for free a kind of robustness to forms of collusion. So basically, a cartel of users trying to collude to get themselves better prices, there's no way they can do that because it's just a posted price mechanism. There's no way that they can manipulate that. Okay, good. So Hannah, I see your question. That's another good question. Good. So let me just wrap up the talk. I'll skip some of the stuff I was going to say, just so we have adequate time for these great questions, because there's now 3 that would be really good to discuss. Okay, so that's the assessment, right? So the contribution here, first of all, it's providing the definitions, which allow you to assess to what extent a transaction fee mechanism like EIP-1559 satisfies its stated goals, first of all. And then secondly, it's sort of working out to what extent it does satisfy those goals. And it gets a quite good grade. Okay, maybe it's not an A+, but I think it's definitely an A. You have the same MMIC and OCA proof properties you have in first price auctions. You have them for more subtle reasons, but you have them. And you are definitely more DSIC than a first price auction. Okay, so except in hopefully exceptional circumstances, it acts just like a posted price mechanism. Okay, so I interpret all this as a pretty strong, vote of support for the design. Okay, that would be my takeaway. All right, so it's not to say so there's no optimality result in this work. I'm not saying this is the best imaginable transaction fee mechanism, and I do think it's definitely worth exploring the rest of the design space and trying to understand what it looks like and what the other options are, what other trade-offs are possible. As I mentioned, one detail is EIP-1559 burns the base fee revenues. That's not crucial for the game theory. So for example, you could instead pay it forward to miners of future blocks. You would still have OCA proofness if you did that. That would be kind of a different macroeconomic choice if you think about it, because then you wouldn't be burning anything, so you wouldn't be affecting the inflation rates. And in effect, you'd be rewarding the miners at the expense of the holders of the native currency, which, some people probably think is a good thing. Some people probably think is a bad thing. I just want to point out, that there is this kind of trade-off in the design space. Now, another design which I suggested, which I still think is worth discussion, is to try to actually simplify EIP-1559 by taking one of the 2 user-specified parameters and instead make it hard-coded inside the mechanism. Okay, so the fee cap, the user's valuation, that you obviously have to elicit from the users, but you can definitely imagine instead of eliciting a tip, just having a hard-coded tip, right? That some nominal amount. This would be a parameter that gets adjusted over time the same way things like the block reward gets adjusted over time. The good news is there's senses in which this would be simpler for users, especially sort of casual users. So first of all, now you don't need any assumptions at all about whether the base fee is roughly accurate or not. You don't need any assumptions at all about people overbidding. It's literally now just a dominant strategy in the usual sense to submit your true valuation as the fee cap. So that's good. It's also good that you only have to think about 1 bidding parameter, not 2. Okay, so I think from the simplicity of the casual user and sort of the incentive compatibility property, I think it's a win. The thing you give up on with this change in design is the OCA proofness is now going to hold only when the base fee is not excessively low. If the base fee is excessively low, now you have transactions competing for inclusion in this double full block. With a hard-coded tip, they do not have an in-protocol vocabulary to compete with each other. So one would expect them to compete off-chain. One would expect off-chain markets to arise to sort of handle congestion in these hopefully transitory periods of way too high demand. And so that's true. You really would expect that. I think one could debate to what extent that's a deal breaker. Like maybe it's fine. Maybe we're all okay with people having these smart contracts that only get invoked, when it's sort of very high demand. Maybe that's fine. So I think this is another part of the design space that people should keep in mind. There's a lot of interesting discussion to have about sort of longer timescales. This I'm going to skip. I only addressed incentives for miners at the timescale of a single block. Right? So I just assumed that a miner's sole goal in life was to maximize its profit from the block it's mining right now. For a miner that's mining blocks very rarely, like if you're only mining a block once a week or something, that's probably a very good assumption. If you're a mining pool that's mining 1 out of every 5 blocks, it's definitely worth thinking carefully about, okay, is there some reason a mining pool might deviate in some way to give up some revenue now to get more revenue later, for example, by manipulating the base fee. And in the full report, the work that I did, I talk about these points at some length, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A also, if people are interested. So let me quickly mention a couple open questions. This is the last slide, then we'll move on to the questions. So first of all, you'll notice I never showed you a transaction fee mechanism that had the best of all worlds, that was always all three properties. The best we had two different designs that picked two properties to get always, and a third property to get accept in periods of shifting, of suddenly sort of increasing demand. I think it's natural to conjecture that you can't get all three at the same time. And I believe Elaine Shih from CMU and collaborators have made some progress on this question. But that I think would be really nice to have solved. Problem two is do some game theory about the long-term incentive effects that miners face in this mechanism. And then a third one is that, the base fee that I flashed, a little while ago probably struck you as kind of arbitrary, like, maybe even a little overly simplistic. I think that's a fair reaction. I expect Ethereum to iterate on this base fee update rule as the years go by. And I think this is an opportunity where Ethereum could really help. Ethereum might be able to give guidance about, what kinds of base fees would be optimal, or at least better than the sort of placeholder one that's in there right now. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for joining. Really glad you spent this hour listening to the seminar, and very happy to now move on to some of the excellent questions that have come in. So, thanks.
Yeah, so we have a number of additional questions, not totally unrelated to the earlier ones. You had deferred a question from Jerry and Siamak, and now Hannah, of course, threw one in on miners also. Do you want to take one of those first?
Yeah, let me try to figure out the optimal order here. Let's see. Maybe let me start with Hannah's question. So Hannah asks, given that users will not pay more under 1559 than under a first price option, and now given that part of that fee is burned, miners are getting a lower reward. So won't it affect miners' participation and thus security? So that's a great question. So you're absolutely right that on the user side, right, you're basically just going to be paying market, right? It's not, I agree that, to first order, you don't expect users to be paying more post EIP-1559. It's sort of the same from their perspective. And you're right that pie is getting split differently. Okay, the miners now only get the tips and no longer get the base fee revenues. So I'd say there's 2 points worth discussing. So point number one is, it may sound from the talk like they're losing almost all of their revenue. And so the first thing is to actually discuss like how much of their revenue is going away. And then we can discuss, okay, given that, what are the implications on security? So, and this relates very much to Jerry's question, actually. So Jerry's absolutely right when he says that there are 3 sources of revenue for the miners, in effect. There's, first of all, the block reward, okay, which again is significant. Then there's kind of the transaction fees from kind of, then there's the transaction fees that are paid. And then there's this miner extractable value. Okay, so what is that? So miner extractable value is basically noticing that the content of the transactions themselves provide you with opportunities for additional income. So a canonical example here would be basically to do front running, or even kind of like, a combination of front running and back running. So if you're mining a block and you're about to put some really large trade in your block, so that's going to get executed when your block gets executed. One thing you can do is make up your own transaction, do a trade initially in the same direction as the big trade, then have the big trade execute, and then trade in the reverse direction. Okay, and this will basically just, this is basically free money. Okay, because you're basically controlling the order flow. The miner is controlling the order flow, in effect. Now, the way this is sort of, starting to work through systems like Flashbots and so on, the miners themselves are often not the ones like bothering to look for these opportunities, but rather there's sort of another pool of entities known as searchers. They spend all their time trying to come up with blocks that would generate a lot of side revenue of this form, and then they basically submit that to the Ethereum miners along with a bid, which basically says, look, I figured out this way to sort of make 10 ETH, by sort of ordering the block in this way and adding these transactions. I'll pay you 9 ETH, miner, because you're the one who actually has the power to include this. I'll keep the other ETH for myself. So in some sense, that source of revenue gets lumped in with the tips, right? Because it might just be an on-chain payment made by a searcher. But in any case, conceptually, I agree there's these three different sources. So back to Hannah's question, right? So like how much revenue are miners actually losing? Well, they're not losing the block reward at all, okay? And the block reward, again, is fairly significant. Historically, transaction fees per block were less than the block reward. There's now been some stretches. There's been the occasional month recently where transaction fee revenue was actually slightly more than the block reward revenue. So it's getting closer to sort of the 50-50 split. But still, miners are going to keep that, let's call it 50% of the revenue in the block reward. And then within the other 50% they're getting from transaction fees, the expectation is that for the casual user who's not doing any shenanigans, manipulating, markets and, market makers and whatnot, the miner will lose those transaction fees, sort of the marginal transaction, because all of that's going to just sort of go into the base fee. But for these sort of special transactions that are generating MEV, they will probably still be using fairly high tips to ensure that they're included kind of, for example, at the beginning of the block or specific positions in the block. So overall, miners won't lose the block reward. They probably won't lose the revenue they're getting from MEV-related transactions, or at least not that much of it. So, they're not, they're losing, let's call it 25% or 30% or something like that of their revenue. Okay, so that's the first point to make, is just they're losing something, but they're not losing everything. So that's the first piece of.
Can I just ask a related question here, which is that, so the relationship between mining revenue and, let's say, security, let's say my ability to, double spend on the blockchain, that's going to be a nonlinear relationship, right? Like if we think about, for example, Ether prices 2 years ago and, the revenues miners had then because Ether prices were so much lower, I'm guessing even though the base fee is being burnt now, they're probably making much more now than they were maybe 2 years ago. And you wouldn't think of Ethereum as being particularly insecure 2 years ago, would you?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So let me talk. So this is sort of exactly where I was going. So to Hannah's question, and also kind of partially answering Jerry's question, 1559 should make some fraction of miners' revenue go away, but it's not a majority. Okay, it's some significant, but call it, let's say, 20 to 30%. Now, the rest of your question says, won't it affect miners' participation and thus security? And this also starts touching on CMAC's question. CMAC's done some really important work on exactly this topic. So absolutely yes, right? So if the payout to miners drops, then the marginal miner will become unprofitable and turn off their machine, or just sell their ASICs or whatever they've got, on a secondhand market. So absolutely. So the security, by security I mean roughly like the current economic investments going into trying to mine Ethereum blocks, right? So think kind of like electricity costs plus like depreciation of hardware that you're using to do the mining. So and CMAC's work makes this kind of very crisp and precise, that basically, as security as the rewards going to miners goes up and down, so too, in the same way does the security in that sense go up or down. So Hannah, in other words, I agree with you that you would expect security in that notion, in that definition, to go down by some percentage, let's say 25%. So my understanding is that the broad belief in the Ethereum community at the time this mechanism was being proposed and discussed was that the block reward alone, so the 2 ETH per block, was already sufficient for what the community believed was an adequate level of security. And that really anything going to the miners beyond the basic block reward, again, you can find people who disagree with this, but from talking to a bunch of people, this is the majority opinion I got. That basically any payment to miners above and beyond the block reward is simply overpaying for security. And that sort of reducing that overpayment would be beneficial to the network. And again, people argue about this, but I think many people had that opinion. So the short answer is, like, yes, it'll affect participation. Yes, it'll affect security, but it doesn't, for the people who should know best, they don't seem very concerned. Related to Fahad's point that, I mean, it's a little tricky because it's sort of like you kind of want the security to scale, I would say, like with the value of the blockchain is the one thing that's a little weird. So you could look back 2 years ago and say, oh, they were making much less. But then you also might say, oh, well, we would have been comfortable with a much lower level of security 2 years ago because we weren't sort of, trying to secure this many billions of dollars. So it's a little tricky, but anyways, so that's one does expect, all else being equal, total hash rate to be less, but also that it's, hopefully still plenty high enough that something like a 51% attack would be sort of prohibitive for anybody other than like really big nation states. Okay.
So can I actually ask a question that's sort of related to some of what you've been discussing here? Because, I mean, so Ethereum, of course, is at least planning to transition to proof of stake. They keep on saying so, at least. And so what are the implications for security given the EIP if they were proof of stake? Because I guess the discussion about, mining in the traditional sense no longer applies, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends. Right, so the question is, how will EIP-1559 interact with proof of stake? Is that right?
Yes, and particularly since a lot of this discussion is centered around security, I'm curious to have a sense of how the security dimension in a proof of stake blockchain would look with EIP in place, EIP-1559.
Yeah, I mean, so the first order. So you can define economic security in various ways, but like just I think a very simplistic but also useful notion is just the current economic investment in doing the mining or doing the validating, whatever, however you want to talk about it. So again, for proof of work, that's going to be electricity costs and hardware depreciation. For proof of stake, it's going to be generally capital costs. And right, so to be a validator, you have to stake some amount. It's actually quite significant in for ETH 2.0 for their proof of stake system. It's 32 ETH, which is now around 100 grand. So if you want to be a validator, right? I mean, there's other third parties that kind of like pull people together, but it's 100 grand to be a validator. Furthermore, if your validator is buggy, you can get slashed, right? So first of all, you're not doing anything else with that 100 grand. Second of all, it's not even completely riskless, and you can't withdraw it immediately. Like there's usually some kind of cool down period. And so what that means is, like at any given moment, and in fact, you can even measure on chain in some sense the current investment, into validation, which is just kind of the sum of all the stakes that are locked up. And so the point being is, like, if you were an attack, so why do I think this is a good notion? Because it's kind of like, you do a mental experiment, like, oh, well, what if an attacker, what if some big nation state wanted to, in a proof of work system, buy so many ASICs or build so many ASICs that they would single-handedly have 51% of the hash rate? Or like, what if a single actor in ETH 2.0 wanted to sort of acquire enough ether and stake enough ether so they had 51% of sort of the stake amount? That's basically like taking the investment that already exists and then doubling it. So sort of the current investment is also a very loose proxy for the investment required to launch a 51% attack. So if you have a proof of stake blockchain and you have tons of stakes sort of locked up, I mean, I still think there's a very strong sense of economic security there, just because the expense of sort of capturing 51 or maybe 34 is the relevant number percent of the stake would still be prohibitively high for almost anybody. Does that make sense what I said? Or
Yeah. And so we're running a little bit out of time though, so maybe we can take one of these other questions and then conclude. Would that be okay?
Sure. Yes. I mean, I think all of these I can answer very briefly. So let me just maybe take a second.
Better.
So Lu Yao asks about the effect of EIP-1559 on waiting time. So this is something that would be good to see data on. I'd say, I mean, the thing to realize is there's two reasons you might be waiting. One is literally just you're not willing to pay the market clearing price, and no mechanism is going to help you there, right? It's just sort of, if you're just outcompeted by people willing to pay more, who truly value it more, you will wait until sort of demand drops. The problem with sort of the first price auctions is you wait. Sometimes the waiting is an artifact for a mistake in your wallet's fee estimation algorithm. And that's really frustrating, because then you're waiting not for fundamental economic reasons, but just because of, an insufficiently good, algorithm / mechanism. so it'd be nice to measure how much that's gotten better. I haven't seen any empirical work on that. So Yulin, basically no. Basically, you know, doing things like disincentivizing front running, I think it's a super, super important problem. Really interesting. I don't think this work really has much to say about it. Lots of people are starting to work on it. You know, I think both this, and it's a great issue that really spans, I think, computer science and economics in an interesting way. Robert asked about why 2x. So you're right, you could do 3x. There's some nice symmetry properties of 2x, but it's not, the 2 is not fundamental. I think it is probably the most natural choice if you have to choose a number, but there's no fundamental reason why you couldn't do 3 instead. And it wouldn't be shocking if they actually modified the protocol in the future to change the 2 to 3. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened at some point.
Okay, well, thank you for clearing out the questions there. And so we're right at time. So I want to thank Tim for being here and presenting this very insightful work and explaining to all of us what EIP-1559 is. I also want to note that we have another event in 2 weeks, which is at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursday, the 21st. It's going to be hosted by Hannah Haliburta at NYU Stern, who had the very interesting question on mining earlier just now. So thank you all for attending. Tim, thank you so much for being here. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.